Welcome back to Vox Terra for the long-term survival of the species. Today, racist mass shooting in Buffalo, New York at a supermarket in a largely African-American neighborhood. An underreported racist shooting in Texas in a largely Korean neighborhood at a hair salon. Gun violence, the reemergence of racism or Nazism as a political philosophy in context with the collapse of communism, anti-socialism, the decline of the churches, and climate change. Well, let us start with gun violence. Because regardless of motive, throughout history, individuals and groups have engaged in murder and suicide. So I believe it was an expert on gun violence I heard in an interview on NPR explaining that the most common way a mass shooter is stopped and tackled is when that shooter stops to reload their gun. Guns, like other hazards, have risk factors. Factor 1, firepower or caliber. I believe a .22 caliber is the lowest power or firearm. If the shooter misses their intended target, that bullet is less likely to have the power to fly through a wall and kill or injure an unintended victim. If the shooter hits the intended victim, that victim is more likely to survive. Next, capacity, or how many bullets that gun or its magazine can carry. Traditionally in the modern era, what I'm used to is the 6-round capacity, meaning a gun, a clip, or a magazine that can contain 6 bullets before one needs to stop and reload. High capacity, like 30 rounds, means more shots fired before the shooter needs to stop. Factor 3 is the firing mechanism, or the action. With manual action, more traditional, the shooter needs to make a move like you might have seen in cowboy or Old West movies. Cock the gun, maneuver a bolt, pump it, before that gun can shoot the bullet, creating a slight pause between shots, forcing that shooter to think momentarily. Now, a semi-automatic, all the shooter needs to do is pull the trigger. Fully automatics, which as far as I'm aware are not legal in the US, can easily be modified out of a semi-automatic. Fully automatics, the shooter can simply spray bullets, especially if there's now a high capacity magazine. Now, my solution or focus, I believe, addresses sincere conservative and sincere liberal concerns. But here we want to always stop and think, how are we defining these terms liberal and conservative? I'm saying sincere because I do not believe my solution would necessarily please the gun industry. So the main philosophical or political arguments for gun ownership: hunting, the Constitution, self-defense, and then a defense against tyranny or a defense against the government or the authorities itself. Now, that last one has varying degrees of what I consider reasonableness, where taken to its extreme, you're really creating the grounds for armed revolution, or paramilitary groups that will actually serve the opposite purpose of what those advocates think they're doing. But lastly, what I don't hear much of is privacy. So we have a trade-off between beliefs and ease of access to deadly weaponry. I would solve those concerns about defense and privacy by limiting unpermitted private gun ownership to lower power, lower capacity, manual action, less concealable long arm, for example, a .22 caliber manual action rifle with a 6-round capacity. Now, in terms of calling it an assault rifle ban, I have a slight problem with that in that it's more of a stylistic description rather than technical. My concern about background checks as the primary solution is that we get into 2 issues: politics, or the picking and choosing of who gets to own a weapon and who doesn't, and privacy. Now, there's records being kept of who owns and who doesn't. I don't think you really have freedom unless you have some level of privacy. Now, many liberal-minded thinkers may believe they don't have a problem with background checks as the primary means, meaning seeing how stable or whatnot that individual potential purchaser is. But if we put this in context of politics, we could easily imagine a situation in the future of an America dominated by people who identify as right-wing or conservative, creating criteria within those background checks that would exclude leftists or even liberals from owning firearms. Now, many of the arguments in favor of more easy access to ownership of more powerful weaponry are really stemming from the belief of many that they are seeing themselves as standing up for freedom against some type of tyranny. Now, while I get the concept of if you have an armed government, then you want to also have an armed citizenry to counterbalance, I get that concept, but that is not what I think is really happening. There are no natural checks or ends to that argument. Why limit it to high capacity, high power rifles, why not also allow grenade launchers? So here now I'm really bumping into the concept of these large armed groups that are within the United States who might refer to themselves as militias and see themselves as conservative or see themselves as right wing. And whether you're in one of those groups, support them or oppose them, I want to say that to a large extent, I think really the opposite is going on with these organizations than what many of its sincere believers believe is happening. In some ways, rather than standing up for freedom, I think they're actually sort of positioning to serve a similar function that what are called the right-wing paramilitaries in Latin America, especially during the 1980s, but apparently even to this day somewhat serve, which is defending vast wealth inequalities. So in the American context, my two pieces of evidence, one's historical. If we look back to the 60s and 70s, when there were armed groups who people would have classified as being on the left, or even really just non-white armed groups, here I'm thinking about the Black Panthers as well as the American Indian Movement, those groups, it is my impression, were broken up by the FBI. Now coming to today or more recent times, it was a really underreported but important story coming out of Oregon that an Oregon militia stood up to oppose cap and trade, which was a regional cap and trade, which was an agreement to limit the amount of fossil fuels being burned. Notably also, there was apparently Koch money. The Kochs are infamous for promoting climate denial and opposing environmental regulations, also opposing that regional cap and trade. As far as I'm aware, I don't know of any of these self-proclaimed militias standing up to oppose the government when it is seizing lands under eminent domain to expand oil and gas pipelines, nor am I aware of them ever standing to oppose the extraction of oil and gas or other minerals on public lands. I'm aware of no armed groups within the United States with any sizable following that are really opposing capitalism in general. So next, I believe that the reemergence of racism as a philosophy and gaining appeal again is at least in part attributable to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decline of communism and anti-socialism. Let me explain why. At the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of thinkers were considering how do we get to a better society. Here we have these new forms of production that should be benefiting humanity, but yet it seems like what's actually happening is many people are being displaced from their pastoral or agrarian lifestyles and now working under extremely brutal conditions in factories and so on. Well, Karl Marx was one of those thinkers. So let's set aside what's been demonized about him. According to a BBC documentary, Marx was only 24 years old when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He viewed history as a struggle between haves and have-nots, or those in power and those not in power. And the way he believed to get to this better society was for the working people to wake up and realize they are being exploited and they could have a much better deal if they united and owned the means of production and then distributed goods according to human needs. Now, within left-wing thinking, racism or prejudice would be viewed as a tool, or at least serving the function of dividing the working people so that they can continue to be exploited by the owning class. Now, fast forward a bit from 1848 to pre-Nazi Germany. And as I've shown you in other videos, there was street battles going on between the communists, leftists, labor, and the Nazis. The Nazis were offering a different alternative to Germany's plight. Rather than saying all workers are in it together against the owners, they chose instead to say all real Germans are in it together against the non-Germans, and that these leftists are interfering. They portrayed communism and socialism as a Jewish plot. So in that way, the Nazi solution protected these vast wealth inequalities, reinstituted a system of slave labor, and confiscated the wealth from those considered not true Germans. Now, please note, according to one history I read, that many of the lower-level Nazi activists did not believe they were signing up for war and genocide, but believed they were simply having a Make Germany Great Again platform. So it's my belief that with the collapse of that Soviet Union and the collapse of leftist ideology worldwide, people in stressed conditions now are gravitating towards the opposite philosophy. Another factor, which might seem contrary to some people but not to me, is the decline of the mainline churches, or the decline of churches in general. The churches offer a different view, let's say a biblical view on racism. Here, the church community would view racism as a sin. We are all children of God. So going to the civil rights movement in America of the 60s and 70s, there was two factors. There was capitalism having to prove that it was not racist as it was being accused of by communists, and there was the church movement, which viewed racism as a sin. Well, for a while, it seemed like everything's holding together in society after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the decline of the churches. But now, in 2022, it's becoming obvious to many people that something is wrong. Climate change is coming down like a ton of bricks, and wealth and power inequality is growing. So people, again, like at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, are losing their sense of purpose and who they are and where they fit in. So not only is racism reemerging in the absence of a true challenger to unfettered capitalism, but I believe, like last time in Nazi Germany, it also serves a function to lock the system in place. Now, coming to today's political climate, please keep in mind that many of the racist organizations, their belief and their desire is to spur on what they imagine to be a race war. Now, I put it as imagine because I believe we are only, every one of us that is really only a feature or two off from being classified in another group. And if you go back far enough, all of us have some level of mixed ancestry. But the desire of these attacks is to spur a reaction from people not seen as white, so they will then counterattack and make people who are viewed as white by society feel threatened. Then the situation will spiral from there. Now, I would like to caution you, if that is your belief, I don't think it will succeed in anything but a lot of bloodshed. If you ever seize territory, later, I believe, you will argue over who is really white. It's not going to, of itself, address economic insecurity or environmental calamity. Environmental calamity is brought about by the dominance of vested, powerful industries in our society, chief among them fossil fuel petrochemical. Replacement theory that we've been hearing about operates on two levels. One, blatantly racist thinking, and two, let's call it a watered-down version you might hear on Fox, echoed by, I believe, Tucker Carlson. Claims that Democrats are bringing in the other in order to gain more votes. Well, one, operating at that level, this Democrat versus Republican level, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of voting. In the 90s, all of the immigrants or newcomers I knew, or at least most of them, considered themselves Republican, buying into that image of they're coming here for the American dream and this clean-cut sort of thing, or whatever the imagery that goes along with it, but that's how they identified. And they also tended to identify as conservative, being more supportive of more traditional and extended family structures. So really the newcomers gravitating more towards Democrats, to the extent that's happening, is a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the Republican Party, spurred on by years of Republican rhetoric on immigration. Important to note, replacement theory often claims George Soros is behind the plot. George Soros is Jewish. Here we see a resemblance to Nazi conspiracy theory of the 1930s. And if you're imaginative, you could concoct your own conspiracy theory. Think about this. If newcomers tend to be more conservative than native-born Americans in terms of like family value and that type of thing, then we could imagine that stopping new arrivals from coming here is a plot to undermine conservative social values. Now, I want to address American identity, stepping aside from all this left-right thinking, and my distress about this idea of a real American. One thing I used to think was really cool, for lack of a better word, about the American experiment was that, at least in my belief, anyone could come here, anyone could or be born here and declare themselves an American and say, this is what I believe, this is what I look like, and I'm a real American, and I define America. And I thought that really made us different than many other nations that are based on a particular ethnic group that's really inhabited that spot of land for a very long time. Second, I feel that identity is much more humble, rather than one group claiming they're the real Americans and others are not, because what American, other than the Native Americans, got permission from the Native Americans to be here? Everyone here is newcomers. And everyone should also know about the history of something called the Know Nothing Party, which opposed other European immigrants who it considered to not truly be fitting with the American ideal. Notably, the Irish were opposed. Well, if it's what I call the true left, meaning those who are criticizing or standing up to the excesses of capitalism, who are offering something closer to that I think would be real solutions, healthcare for all, that would calm people down a bit because they wouldn't be so insecure, affordable college, universal basic income, and I get it, there's some debate if that's left or right, but for the most part, I associate that with a more leftist, a Green New Deal, which would help steer this polluting economy towards a less toxic version of itself, then why is it that so many people who are seen by society or identify as white and straight are not feeling like they have a place in the left? Why is it that if it was a coalition of churches and the left that brought about the American civil rights movement, why is it that churches today seem to feel so threatened by so many on the left and liberals? Well, the answer is almost spelled out in the question. And I urge people to take those who consider themselves left or progressive, democratic socialist, liberal, I urge you to take a page from Bernie Sanders when he addressed Liberty University and was willing to give those students there, those evangelical Christian students there, some space to disagree on some of the culture issues when it comes to gender, sex, identity, and reproductive issues, but say, hey, we can all agree that both from a biblical standpoint and his progressive left standpoint, the wealth inequality, the power that these large established corporations have in our society is one of the root causes of so many of our problems, the stress people are feeling and the changes in our climate. I urge you to focus on unifying issues and give people some breathing room on some of these culture issues. To my friends in the conservative movement, I ask you to see what's good in the left and what you can identify with and find common ground where you can. And realize that there is a real problem within the conservative movement of it being too influenced, too dominated by particular business interests, chief among petrochemical fossil fuels. Well, I hope you found this analysis interesting and helpful. And if you disagreed with a lot of it or some of it, I ask you to give me some space. It's a very challenging topic. And until next time, I hope you're subscribing, you're commenting, you're liking. These videos are a lot of work for me, and it's basically at this juncture a volunteer effort. And until next time, and as always, peace be with you.